Now, I am very pleased to introduce our speaker this evening. Dr. Desiree Narango is a conservation scientist at the Vermont Center for Ecostudies. Her research program focuses on understanding how global change impacts bird and insect populations and identifying biodiversity conservation solutions in human-dominated landscapes. Desiree has a Ph.D. in Entomology and Wildlife Ecology from the University of Delaware, a Master's of Science in Natural Resources from The Ohio State University, and a Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Biology from SUNY, ESF. She's also an active naturalist and gardener who enjoys getting others excited about the natural world, and excited we are indeed. Thank you, Desiree, for taking the time to be with us this evening. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rosemary. Thank you for that introduction. And thank you everyone for being here. I'm seeing the numbers creep up and I'm so excited to have so many people listening this evening. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my research program and about several aspects of my program that has to do with thinking about how we can conserve biodiversity in the best kind of living landscape where we live at home. And I'm really excited to share with you a little bit this evening about what the butterflies and the bees and the bees and the birds have basically taught me about how we can participate in personal conservation in the places that we live. And I'm going to share with you a lot of information. I have a tendency to go overboard and just want to tell you everything that I know. And so I just want to reiterate, I want to say right from the get-go that if you're excited about this work, if you're interested, if you want to learn more, please don't hesitate to reach out at any time, either through email or you can visit my website and you can access any of the materials that I share with you today. So the other caveat, or the other thing I want to say is that I'm starting off this talk with a very pessimistic slide, but I promise you that this is the only one. The rest of this talk is about optimism. But if you've been paying attention to the news and you've been looking at the state of biodiversity, it feels very dire. We see tremendous declines of all sorts of wildlife around the globe, declining at very alarming rates, such that we're even calling this the sixth mass extinction. We've lost abundance, biomass, and species of insects. People call it the insect apocalypse or the insect decline. There's a paper that came out recently that stated that we've lost almost 3 billion birds, that's billion birds in the last 50 years, which can make you feel like, what is going on? Is there something that I can do? And much of this is related to the anthropogenic change that we've made in our ecosystems, all the land use changes, the development, the habitat loss. But underlying all of the biodiversity declines, the species that we're missing is a much more insidious kind of extinction, as Dan Jansen says. And I really like this quote. He says that the insidious kind of extinction is the extinction of ecological interactions. And when we lose these interactions between species, we lose ecosystem function, we lose the ecosystem services that these organisms provide. And we also lose ecosystem resilience, which then accelerates species loss. But on a positive note, I would say that if we actually begin to pay attention to these species interactions, we may be able to learn what we need to do in order to make a difference. And that's where much of my research program takes place. And I would also argue that we can't have successful conservation of biodiversity unless we incorporate privately managed land. Across the continental United States, more than 60% of it is considered privately owned. And there's some estimates that in the lower 48, 10 to 15, actually some estimates say 20% of the United States is being used as residential areas alone. And in many urban areas, the habitat and the green space that's locked up in these residential yards can make up more than 50% of the available green space. And so if we want to really improve these areas for biodiversity, we need to study them. We need to understand how they work. We need to understand the species that they support. And we also need to provide the information that people like you can use in your decision making. And so that's where I come in. My research is all about trying to find conservation solutions that work for both people and wildlife. And I can assure you that residential yards can create conservation success stories. And we are increasingly seeing these stories from the Atala butterfly, which was presumed to be an extinct species and was found to be, it was rediscovered in people's yards after gardeners started to plant its preferred host plant, the coon-tea plant. There are neighborhoods in Miami, Florida, endangered orchid conservation, because that's where the last strongholds of those populations have been able to withstand development and other anthropogenic threats. In Boston and in the Washington, D.C. area, where I've done some research, we have wood thrush that are able to nest in neighborhoods that have the kind of complex canopy, forest canopy and understory that this species needs. And also in yards in Minnesota, we have found the endangered rusty-patched bumblebee using the flowers that are found in people's gardens. So there's a lot of these kind of optimistic stories that we keep seeing that tells us that success is possible. But we know that not all yards are supporting these species of conservation concern. So what we really need is a better understanding of what those specific features or landscaping styles or mechanisms that can lead to high quality habitat. And so one way that we can think about how yards are landscaped is just in a broad sense in different kinds of management styles. And so, for example, a typical yard type in the United States might be what we call a tidy lawn aesthetic, where we think about a homogenized turf lawn with just a little bit of a few trees and shrubs, where we have lots of input of fertilizer and pesticides. And you would suspect that that doesn't support a lot of biodiversity. On the flip side, though, is there's a growing popularity of incorporating more nature-based kind of landscaping aesthetics, such as having pollinator gardens or mowing less, or just having more vegetation in your landscape, or incorporating climate-smart water adaptation. And there's been a lot of ideas and in some ways assumptions that these nature-based or nature-friendly yard aesthetics would then support biodiversity. But there hasn't been a lot of research to actually test whether these assumptions are true, and also to determine whether there's generalizable trends across different regions on how yards should be managed to support biodiversity. And so I had the opportunity when I was at University of Massachusetts Amherst working with the US Forest Service, and I was participating in a project called the American Residential Macrosystems Project, and we like to call it the Yard Futures Project. And we were looking at different yards across 6 different cities in the United States to understand how different landscaping styles might be contributing to ecosystem services, to soil quality, to tree abundance, plant diversity, and also the wildlife diversity as well. And so the different kinds of yard types that we considered in this program was first, different yards that were managed primarily for lawn. So yards that are dominated with mostly turf grass, lots of inputs. And then alternatively, we had our conservation yards. So again, these are ones that are either certified by the National Wildlife Federation as certified wildlife habitat, or they could also be incorporating climate smart water conservation tactics. And then finally, we compared these different kinds of yard types to natural parks or naturally regenerating parks. So not the ones with big baseball fields, but comparing to the forests or the desert ecosystems surrounding our different cities. And so just to crunch many, many years of effort and analyses into one slide, what we found in general is that conservation yards tended to have a higher diversity of plants. So when people are choosing the kind of plants and they're really excited about gardening, they tend to plant a lot of different species. When we looked at the bees, we found that there was a higher diversity of some bees, but not all bees, mostly our generalist species. But we only found higher bee diversity in conservation yards in some regions, mostly in our temperate regions, and not necessarily so in our desert ecosystems like in LA or in Arizona. And then finally, for our bird comparisons, we found that the relationships were not very clear that conservation yards were actually having a ton of benefit for the birds. But what we actually found is that yards had the most differences between them, or heterogeneity. So if you went from one conservation yard to another conservation yard, you would have completely different turnover of species composition. So as you scaled up from a single yard to a citywide scale, it's the potential for these conservation yards to support more species. But on a local scale, they were supporting not very much different from lawns and not very many more species of conservation concern. And so building off these results, we didn't have a lot of very clear evidence that conservation yards were doing what we expected them to be doing. So the next question is, why is that? What are some of the features of these yards that might be then driving how the bees and the birds are responding to that type of landscaping? And so one of those features that likely has a very strong influence on which pollinators and birds are able to occupy that yard type, and what I'm going to be talking about for a large proportion of the rest of the talk, is the abundance and diversity of native plants. And so in this particular study, when we looked at overall plant diversity, we saw really high plant diversity in conservation yards. But we also saw lots of variation in native plant diversity and much less native plant diversity compared to the natural native ecosystems. So for example, in Boston, Massachusetts, we had high variation in the diversity of native plants, from 30 to 50% native species, although 50% is pretty darn good for an urban residential yard. And in Los Angeles, California, where we had very low bee and bird diversity in our conservation yards, we saw that most of those yards, even if they were certified as wildlife friendly, had very little native plant diversity. 0 to 7% of the plants that were landscaped in these systems were considered native. And so what I would argue is that if we want to rethink how we landscape our yards for biodiversity, we also need to rethink what our relationships are with the plant management. And that can be one solution that we can have that can potentially have really big impacts, because those really small decisions we make, such as what species to plant, how many trees to have, how often do I mow, has really big impacts on the native plant species that are able to occupy these yards, and then the wildlife that are able to use them. And so for this talk, I want to speak about what are some specific actions that you can take to conserve pollinators and birds at home. And we can come up with a list of dozens and dozens of awesome, amazing things that you can do that will support wildlife. But tonight, I just want to speak about 4 main ones that I feel strongly about. And that's plant native plants, use informed plant selection for ecological functions, so choosing specific species to maximize interactions. I also want you to embrace your lazy side, which I'll speak more about what that means. And finally, I want you to meet your neighbors. So action item 1, plant native plants. If you don't remember anything from this talk, I want you to remember that native plants are supporting our native food webs, and that is a big choice that you can make in order to support biodiversity. And what's the reason for that? Well, Some of you here may be familiar with the monarch butterfly. And the monarch butterfly, when it's in its larval stage as a caterpillar, it feeds exclusively on milkweed plants. So it's one of those amazing stories of ecology that we hear about in kindergarten. If we plant milkweed plants, the caterpillars are happy and they can eat, and then they can grow into the beautiful butterfly. But often in kindergarten and going off into school, that's where the stories end for us. And what I'm here to tell you is that the monarch is not alone, that this degree of specialism is actually really, really abundant in our ecosystems. And to be perfectly honest, I didn't find this out until I went to college. So I'm embarrassed to say, but more than 90% of our plant-eating insects are specialists to some degree. And so what that means is that over evolutionary time, our butterflies and our moths have adapted to use very specific host plants when they're in their larval stage, to which that they've overcome those nasty defensive chemical compounds that are found in the leaf. And they also adapt to the timing of the plant and the look of the plant and all sort of traits that are associated with that plant in order to maximize their survival and reproduction. And so a really great example of this is this caterpillar on this leaf in the upper right corner here, which is the double-toothed prominent, which is a specialist on elm trees. And so you can see that this caterpillar has evolved a really particular look of a double-toothed shape that blends in really nicely with those elm leaves so that it can eat to its heart's content without having to fear as much the risk of predation. And this sort of specialism occurs all across the butterflies and moths, but these species can specialize in a variety of different scales. So we can have species like the rosy maple moth, which feeds exclusively on maple trees. And especially up here in New England, they really like sugar maple. Even though you can find them on all sorts of maple, they really like the sugar maples. So they have a very tight, specialized host plant caterpillar relationship. Then we have species like the Promethea moth that use a few more different kinds of tree and plant groups, but they can exhibit a more regional level specialization. So up here in New England, our Promethea moths tend to be found almost all the time on cherries and sassafras. That's the regional specialization that they show. If you go down to the mid-Atlantic, like Maryland or Pennsylvania, these species tend to use tulip tree more often because that plant is more abundant. And if you go even farther south to Georgia and South Carolina, those same species of Promethea moth are using primarily magnolia trees. So it really depends on where you are in this species distribution and what native tree is best appropriate for that species. And then you have species like the saddled prominent, which is considered a generalist. So they feed on all sorts of types of woody trees and shrubs like maples and birches and hickories and oaks and blueberries. But, you know, even though it could be 20 or 25 different plant groups, if we think about the thousands and thousands of different species of plants that are out there, it's really just a fraction of the amount of plants that are available for this caterpillar to eat. And if we think about all the plants that are being imported and all the ones that we select through horticulture, again, it's really just a very small number of species that this caterpillar needs to complete its full annual life cycle. Going up the food web, those caterpillars and other plant-eating insects are really important for supporting a vast community of invertebrate consumers. Things like beautiful, charismatic ground beetles that keep those caterpillar and plant hopper populations down, and beautiful, amazing jumping spiders. All of these invertebrate consumers are really important to keep the food web in check, and also provides really important protein for other higher order consumers like our beautiful birds. And as an ornithologist who came into entomology late, this is where I was really interested from the get-go. And I was really surprised to find when I started looking at bird diets that the majority of our bird species require insects at some point in the annual cycle. And in fact, if you look at songbirds like cardinals and finches and blue jays, more than 70% of the songbirds across the globe have a majority of their diet is mostly insects. So more than 50% of their diet is reliant on insect biomass. And so in this way, if we want to conserve birds, it really depends on our insect conservation. And our insect conservation is then built on the plant communities that we cultivate. And so if we want to have really effective conservation, we need to really pay attention to those small decisions that we make. And so one of those decisions, like I mentioned before, is whether to plant native or non-native plants. And this can come up a lot when we think about what we want to plant in our gardens, because most of the species that are available in our nurseries and that we find in our gardens, if you're buying a new house, tend to be non-native plants. But unfortunately, the artifact of our decisions to plant all these non-native species, so these are plant species that aren't native to our local ecosystem but have been imported from other countries, is that we have detrimental impacts on biodiversity. On the flip side, if we promote native species, we'll then have positive impacts. So in general, our native species tend to support a higher species diversity. They also tend to support a higher abundance of insect species and a higher abundance and diversity of our more highly specialized species. So our caterpillars, our butterflies, and our moths that use very low number of plants tend to be more often found on native species. And that works out to be, if we make direct comparisons between native and non-native plants in the same ecosystem, supporting about 4 times more caterpillar species and about 2 to 3 times higher abundance in biomass, which is what would matter for those consumers like the birds. Just to put this in perspective, the numbers can be pretty drastic in terms of how the differences in species of butterflies and moths that native and non-native plants support. So this is an example of some native species in Massachusetts. So our oaks are supporting on average at least 477 different butterflies and moths. And on the herbaceous side, goldenrods are supporting at least 131 species. But if we look at some popular non-native species like ginkgo, ginkgo is only known to support 6 species, and many of those are highly generalist species, or even exotic butterflies and moths like spongy moth that could use just about anything out there, and they happen to be using ginkgo. And many of the herbaceous plants that we can find very easily if we go to our local Home Depot, like hosta, zinnia, hyacinth, cosmos, many of them are not known to support any butterfly or moth species at all. So clearly, if we're thinking about supporting the caterpillars that then turn into these butterflies and moths, we need to think about the native species that are actually going to support them. One of the questions that comes up from this is whether it matters if a non-native plant is related to our native species. And I actually have seen this written by other ecologists that don't study these sort of relationships, that say, well, it really doesn't matter if they're related to our native species. And so you could plant something like a Norway maple or a Japanese cherry, which is in the same group as our native red maples and our native black cherries. And I'm here to tell you that that is certainly not true, that it really does matter on whether it's a native cousin or a non-native cousin. And when we make those direct comparisons within plant groups, we see that our non-native species are supporting 40% fewer caterpillars and about 50% fewer species compared to their related natives. The other difference that we see, and this is a study that an undergrad of mine has worked on that's not published yet, but really interesting results, is that even if a caterpillar species is able to eat a non-native plant, so if a cherry specialist caterpillar is eating a Japanese cherry, we also see higher mortality and slower growth, suggesting that these non-native cousins might also be acting as a sort of ecological trap. And this is the kind of study that I really like because I don't have to show you a graph. I can just show you pictures of what those caterpillars look like. So these are Promethea moths after 40 days of eating leaf material. And on the left here is a caterpillar that was raised on native black cherry, and it's basically almost ready to pupate. And on the right here, we have a caterpillar that was from the same female moth that was raised on a non-native Yoshino cherry. And that one was about 3 stages behind in its development, even after the same amount of time. And eventually that caterpillar didn't make it. So even if these females are able to recognize these non-native plants as an appropriate host plant and lay their eggs, those caterpillars are suffering a higher mortality and a slower growth as well. So all these effects that we see on caterpillars can really have cascading effects on the rest of the food web, like I mentioned. And caterpillars in particular can be really important for birds. And we see in the literature again and again that caterpillars are basically an avian superfood. They have high protein, which is important for growing bones and growing feathers. They have high fat and high calories, which makes them a super efficient power packet of food for putting on fat for migration or for growing in the nest. They have high carotenoids from that plant material, which is important for immune function and also to provide coloring, like the red that we see in cardinals. And they have high detection and predictability. So they have very predictable peaks throughout the year that the birds can rely on in order to time their nests. And so it stands to think that if we lose those caterpillars, that we could have detrimental impacts on the birds themselves. And this is just to illustrate just how many caterpillars that it takes to raise one clutch of chickadees. So a chickadee is a small little, about 10-gram bird. It weighs as much as 10 pennies in your hand. And when they're feeding their nestlings in the nest, they're feeding from 390 to 570 caterpillars per day. And they have to feed their young for 16 days before those baby birds fledge. And so it ends up that in order to just raise one nest of chickadees, it takes thousands and thousands and thousands of caterpillars to do that. So we want to make sure that we're conserving as many caterpillars as we can. And so one of the questions that I've had in my research is whether those chickadees can actually recognize the differences between native plants and non-native plants in terms of their ability to support food resources, because we could see over and over again that these non-native trees were supporting less food for the chickadees. And it turns out chickadees aren't dumb. They know exactly where to go for food. And more than 80% of our observations, or more than 85% of our observations were on native plants. And they almost completely avoided non-natives. And the only ones that they chose to forage on were the ones that tended to have food on them. So these chickadees are definitely recognizing where the food is in the landscape. So if you want to support our lovely little chickadees, we got to make sure that those native trees are in our yards. But if the chickadees are recognizing where the food is, the next question from that is whether there's consequences to those songbirds when non-native plants are abundant in our neighborhood. So if the chickadees don't have a choice, are they able to actually raise a nest of young? And so for this study, we considered a native species to be a tree or a shrub that is has a native distribution that includes the eastern United States. So this is a pretty broad definition of what is native. And we were considering not the diversity or the abundance of trees, but the actual volume of trees or the biomass of foliage that was available for this chickadee to forage on. And I should also mention that this study took place in Washington, D.C. on the southern cousin of the black-capped chickadee, which is called the Carolina chickadee. And so what we found in general was our most strongest relationship was that the birds preferred to breed where there were more native trees and shrubs. And that's great. The birds were, again, recognizing what was high quality habitat. And that was our biggest response, is that we wouldn't actually get a nest in those yards if non-native plant biomass was high. Instead, we would just have a sad little male just singing his heart away and never getting a female. But if he did get a female, we also saw negative effects on multiple other stages of the nesting cycle of this bird. So we found that these chickadees in native yards were laying more eggs, their nests were surviving better, those nestlings were growing faster, and they were ultimately fledging more young in yards that had more of that native plant biomass. So there was definitely a positive effect at reproduction for this chickadee, depending on how that neighborhood was landscaped. But for a chickadee, when we think about the population, it's not just reproduction. They also have to survive throughout the year, and they have to, their young have to survive after they leave the nest too. And it could be that suburban and urban areas are just so inhospitable that the benefits of native plants doesn't make as much of a difference. So we had to take those other And so what we found when we took all three of those stages of population growth into one model, we found that as non-native plant biomass increase at the territory level for these chickadees, that population growth strongly declines. So here, this dashed line is replacement. That means that chickadees are producing enough young to sustain the ones that have died over the year. And so once we have very little non-native plant biomass or more of that native plant biomass, those chickadees have at least some chance of producing enough young to sustain a local population. But what we were really interested in was not the overall pattern of these relationships, but in where are those thresholds for where chickadees would potentially not be able to produce enough young. And what we found is that that threshold occurred at 30% non-native plant biomass. So once we get over 30% non-native plant biomass, those chickadees don't have any chance, virtually negligible chance at producing enough young to sustain a local population. So this provides a threshold that people can aim for in order to improve their yards and their neighborhoods for biodiversity, that we really want to aim for less than 30% non-native plant biomass. So that's all I'm going to talk about with the native and non-native comparisons. And if you want to find more about native plants for your yards, especially if you're in New England, the Go Botany website from the Native Plant Trust is a really excellent resource for finding out what is native to your particular county, and has a lot of really great information about plants and their traits and other species that are available for you. So for a bit of the rest of the talk, I want to speak about using informed plant selection for ecological function. And for folks here, even if we just think about native plant species, we know that there's also a lot of variation between different plant species and different plant groups in terms of the number of caterpillars that they support. So for example, one of the great comparisons I like to make is the difference between tulip tree or Liriodendron and oak trees, where tulip tree is supporting about 8 caterpillar species and oak trees are supporting 500 plus, depending on where you are in the United States. And we get this information from going into the houseplant literature, digging into really old scientific papers, and finding out what different plant species that, that caterpillars have been observed feeding on. And we took information from all across the United States on over 3,000 different, or over 2,000 different plant genera. And we found that there are really just a small handful of plants that are supporting most of the butterflies and moths that are out there. In fact, it was about 14% of the plants across the United States are supporting more than 90% of the caterpillar species. And I had already touched on some of those power players, but here are those numbers again that are specific for Massachusetts. So for our trees and shrubs, we have things like oaks that are supporting 478 caterpillar species in Massachusetts. Cherries are supporting 415, willows at 406. And then if we think about herbaceous plants for our gardens, so things like goldenrod, aster, strawberry, and sunflowers are supporting most of the caterpillar species in our state. But it really didn't matter if we were in Massachusetts, if we were in Florida or California or Minnesota, we kept seeing the same plants come up again and again as being disproportionately important for supporting most of the species interactions. And in fact, the power player that comes up as being what we call a keystone plant, or one that is the most important for supporting caterpillar diversity in a given region, are oak trees. And on average, across the United States, they're supporting more than 20% of the caterpillar species out there. Whereas the average plant, if you were to just choose one randomly in a landscape, less than 1% of the caterpillar diversity. So those oaks are really incredibly important for supporting a large variety of butterflies and moths, including in Massachusetts, 21% of the moth species. And for our butterflies, 14 different butterfly species are relying on oaks as well. The other thing that we found in our research is that the plants that are good for pollinators are also good for birds. So here are chickadee species again, when we were looking at individual plant differences in how much those chickadees were preferring them relative to other plants in the landscape, we found that the more species of caterpillar that a tree supports, the more that those birds were preferring to forage in them. And again, we see our power player oaks, which for the mid-Atlantic region are supporting about 432 different caterpillar species. They were highly, highly preferred by chickadees. And in any neighborhood that you went in, if there was an oak tree there, there was a chickadee that was foraging in it. But the other thing that I noticed while I was watching these chickadees forage in these different neighborhoods is when these chickadees were breeding, when they were raising their young in the nest, it was also spring migration. And so this is when birds are flying from Central and South America up to the boreal forests of Canada. And they don't necessarily breed in people's yards or in urban areas, but they have to stop in those yards to rest and refuel along the way. And actually, while I was studying these chickadees, I just kept seeing all these beautiful, amazing warblers and tanagers and orioles and all these amazing, beautiful jewels up in these oak trees. And so I ended up doing a study here in Massachusetts to see whether the abundance of oak trees has a benefit for these migratory birds that aren't breeding here, that are just moving through. And this work is still in progress, but so far our results are really suggesting that if you have a green space that has a large abundance of oak trees, that those migratory birds are in better nutritional condition too. So they're packing on more fat more quickly, and they're able to take off and make the rest of their journey. And so in this way, if you plant an oak tree or a cherry tree or a willow that supports all this food for birds, you're helping not just the birds that are breeding there, but all the birds that are stopping at your rest stop along the way as well. In addition to plants that are good for our caterpillars and for our birds, are many species that are disproportionately important for our pollinating bees as well. In the Eastern United States, about 30% of our native bees are specialists. So that works out to about 120 specialist species. And there's this great resource from USGS that shows all the different pollinator plants that are important for specialist bees. So these are bees that only feed very particular pollen types to their brood in the nest. And in bees, many cases, it's like one plant group to one specialist bee, but we can add up how many of those specialist bee, or how many bees do particular plants support, and see if there's any that are supporting more than others. And these are the ones that I pulled out from their database. And so things like goldenrods are supporting about 34 species of specialist bees. Sunflowers are supporting about 34 species as well. Asters, 29. Willows are supporting 14 species, and blueberries at 10. And I put a star next to some of these plants because if you remember from the other slide that I had, many of these plant groups that are important for bees or for specialist bees are also really important for caterpillars too. So now we have these plants that we can really maximize the amount of species interactions that we're able to support in our yards by choosing these plants that are really great for caterpillars, really great for bees, and really great for the birds too. I recently took a job at the Vermont Center for Ecostudies, and we just finished our Vermont State of the Bees, which is a full state look at the species diversity and abundance across the state. But another project that we've just started to dig into are the bee-plant interactions. And we've amassed more than 20,000 different observations of bees on plants so that we can do some of these similar analyses that we did on caterpillars to identify what plants and what are the traits of those plants that people could prioritize in their gardening to support our bee communities and our imperiled species. And this is just an example for the osmia, the mason bees, which is a group that consists of both specialists and generalist species of bees. And we can see many of the groups of plants that I mentioned that are supporting a lot of the specialist bees are also supporting the generalists as well. So we have things like asters and goldenrod and sunflowers, our blueberries, our rhododendron, and our roses and our cherries are really the osmia seem to be keying in on, but we have a lot of data to dig into. So I'm hoping to have some resources for you in the near future that are relevant to Vermont as well as other areas in New England. If you want to get some more information about bee-friendly plants for your area, you can visit the Xerces Society, which has great information about plants across the flowering period for bees, as well as this wonderful resource from the Cornell Botanical Garden on creating pollinator gardens specifically for specialist bees. So if we're creating gardens for the specialist bees, we're also going to be supporting the generalists as well. So we're going to be able to get more bang for our buck. So for the last little bit here, I'm going to speak about the final actions that I want you to take, and I'm going to zip through this so we have time for questions. But action number 3 I want you to keep in mind is to embrace your lazy gardener. So less is more. So I've talked a lot about plant selection, and that's a great action to take, but you can also take action by doing less effort and less management in your green spaces. And there's a lot of talk about low mow or reducing your mowing. And that is one step that you can take. And there is a little bit of evidence to support that can be good for pollinators, especially bees. But I also want to present to you the idea of reducing just your lawn area so that you have less to mow. So setting aside more of your lawn for natural areas, for trees, for shrubs, for regenerating meadows that you don't have to put a lot of effort in and that are really supporting a lot of the pollinators that we need. The other decision that you could make is to promote mow-friendly native plants. So there are many plants that are both native but also resilient to frequent mowing, like violets, which are an important host plant for fritillary butterflies, and wild strawberry, which is highly used by both caterpillars and bees. They can withstand frequent mowing. So you can still have a place for your kids to play, but you can also have floral resources throughout the year. Another thing that you can do to embrace your lazy gardener is to create soft landings, or another way to say this is to leave the leaves. So we've been promoting this idea of soft landings around trees that are really important for supporting the eating period of the caterpillar. But once they pupate, once they go into their cocoon, they have to find a place to overwinter or to complete their annual life cycle. And for many cases, for many species, that place is in the leaf litter. So it's really critical that we not just plant those native trees and shrubs, but we also provide a soft landing for those insects to go to so that they can complete that full life cycle. And so this sort of leaf litter or soft landings under trees can provide places to pupate for species like the Luna moth, overwintering habitat for bumblebee queens, and it can also provide winter buffets for birds, because a lot of birds, even in the winter, when it doesn't seem like there's a lot of insects out there, they're still searching for those pupating insects to get that key protein to help them survive the harsh winters. So those can be really great habitat locations to keep in your yard. The last action item that I want to talk to you about before I finish up here is to meet your neighbors. And what I mean by meet your neighbors is to take the time to learn about all of the pollinators and birds and other biodiversity that you can find in your yard. And the more that you look, the more species that you'll probably find. I'm continuously amazed by what I can find in just a small little suburban yard, just by taking the time to look. And I encourage you, if you haven't already, to check out the website iNaturalist, which is a wonderful website where you can upload photos of different wildlife that you find in your yard, and you can crowdsource information to help you identify what that might be. So for example, I uploaded a bee here that I wasn't really sure what species it was. And only a couple of days later, someone came with the actual species identification for me. So it's a really fun resource that you can use to help learn about all of the different wildlife around you. I also encourage you, I've talked a lot about species interactions and how useful they can be for identifying what plants are really important for your region. But a lot of what I've done so far is at really broad scales, and we need to have much more regionally specific information. And there's a lot of potential for using resources like iNaturalist to crowdsource more plant-animal interaction data so that we can help provide the information to you on what plants are important to your area. So if you see a caterpillar on a host plant, take a picture of it, upload it on iNaturalist. If you see a bee on a flower, upload it, and you could have a part in some of the research that I share in the near future. The last thing that I want to say is to connect with your neighboring community as well, because your actions can create really lasting change. So I've talked a lot about what you can do at home, and that's an amazing step. But you can also take what you've learned here, especially if you're excited about making change in your neighborhood or beyond. Take that to your neighbor, take that to other areas around you, and share the information. And if you want some resources to talk to your neighbors or your homeowners association, your plant nursery, or even your state representatives, feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to help you make change in the community that you have the most influence in. And I can assure you that people are really making big differences. We have Somerville, Massachusetts recently passed its first of a kind native plant ordinance. And we also potentially have some ordinances going up in other states to require native plants in new developments that are going up. And that all comes from people like you speaking up and making your needs known to decision makers. So I encourage you to try to create as much change as you can. So with that, that's everything that I have for you today. I appreciate you tuning in and listening to all the information that I throw at you. If you'd like to download any of these papers or any of the graphics that I share, please visit my website, and I'll take any questions that you have. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Desiree. That was a wonderful and very informative talk. Thank you so much. We have, as you might imagine, a number of questions that have been asked.
I'm happy to answer them.
Yes, I will do my best, everyone, to get to everyone's questions. And I do see there's sort of a side conversation happening in the chat, which is totally fine. But if there are questions that you want Desiree to answer, please put them in the Q&A so that I can see them. Okay, so our first question is, I'll try and sum it up in a more concise way. It's basically asking, if you have a property that's not landscaped and you have sort of wild vegetation, is it better to sort of specifically plant something like milkweed, or is it better to let the local growth just do its thing, especially if it has flowering plants that are attracting butterflies, please?
Yeah, I mean, so that's a big question. Like, what's the best thing to do? The best thing to do is what works for you and your ecosystem and what's appropriate for your region. So for instance, right now I live in a heavily, heavily forested region. So if I, cut the whole thing down, I probably wouldn't do so. It wouldn't be so great for the local biodiversity, even if I was planting milkweed. Which milkweed is wonderful, but it only supports a handful of milkweed specialists. So you want to try to keep something that's diverse, provide a diversity of different habitat types. But really, honestly, if it's a naturally regenerating local ecosystem, it's probably doing really great on its own. And you might want to talk to somebody like a local arborist or a local forester that can talk to you about what kind of changes that you might be able to make to improve an already amazing ecosystem. So you might be able, it may be that your forest could use some more structure to provide more habitat for birds, or maybe edges that have meadow, and it might require not that much effort on your part in order to get there. But it's totally okay if you really like monarch butterflies and you want to have a garden next to your house. That patch could be critically important too. So I think it's possible to have. It's not an either or. You can have all of those things.
Excellent, thank you. There's a question here that I think many of us have, which is, how do you protect young native plants from rabbits? We planted New England aster and goldenrod, and both were immediately eaten. And this is Alyssa asking, and she's in the Boston area. Yeah,
oh, that's a tricky one. So I have to give you the caveat that I am an ecologist and I study the ecological relationships. I do not have quite the green thumb, but there is a lot of amazing landscape designers and like master gardener programs that can provide some amazing advice to get at exactly those questions. I know, I've had some native plants that I really wanted to protect from the deer browse, because that was a major issue near me, even with my dog outside all the time. And I ended up having to fence them off to keep them away until they could establish themselves. But part of this, for the bigger picture is that we need a balanced ecosystem. So we need things to keep the rabbits population under control so that the plants can thrive. And this is a major issue with plant conservation, is to make sure that if we're promoting native plants, that it's not something that requires our continuous input. We want to make sure that they can survive. This is a long-winded way of me not having the right answer for you. But there are some plants that, like deer and rabbits, tend to not eat. But I think there's a lot of different options that you could take to depend on what your specific situation is. Thank you. Yeah, it's we all know the struggle. Alyssa has also asked, if we have a native tree like a pin oak, should we start a tree nursery by planting them in pots so we have trees ready to plant if we find a spot, or can create a Miyawaki forest? Yeah, I love that idea. I do that all the time. I plant, I have a healthy population of viburnums, and I like planting them and growing them and then leaving them on my out at my curb and say free plants, and hope that people take them and put them in your yard. I mean, the best part if there's a local plant that's producing tons of seed, most of that is not going to reproduce, that's not going to grow into a new tree. But the more that you can propagate that local genetic stock, the better. There's going to be some things that you buy at nurseries that might not be able to propagate. But I think that's a wonderful way to increase and to share and to create as much of a forest that you can.
Awesome. Vicky asked, how does one compute biomass, and how many native plants would one have to plant in order to counteract an acre of lawn?
Sure. So in terms of counteracting an acre of lawn, I don't have that specific information for you, but I can tell you that the way that we calculate biomass is in that particular study, we actually measured the volume of the shrubs and the volume of the canopy. And we used a basic equation that would calculate the volume of a cylinder. And then we use that to estimate how much biomass is native and non-native in that neighborhood. People have asked me before, because we provide 70% native plants. That's the threshold. That's what we want to go for. And the next question is of course, what does that mean for me? And for that particular study, it was based around an average of, an easy way to measure is the diameter of a tree. So rather than doing all these fancy measurements of the canopy, if you just took the diameter of a tree, so think about like a mature oak tree is like 30 centimeters diameter. So for a chickadee to actually show up and say, okay, I like this spot, I want to hang out, you needed a minimum 200 centimeters of trees. And so if 300 centimeters of trees, and so if like around 200 of that was native, then there was a chance for the chickadees to have a successful nest. So that worked out to be about planting 4 big trees, or 8 to 10 medium trees, or having 12 to 16 large shrubs. But it also considered not just you, but also your neighbors around you. So this is again a long-winded way of me trying to justify the quantitative aspects of that study, but the take-home message for you is the more that you can, the better. So the more vegetation that you can have, the more of it that's native, the more you're going to be able to counteract all of that area of land that is not serving any ecological function. So you do the best that you can. The more trees you have, the better, at least in the temperate eastern ecosystem.
Awesome, thank you. And Sarah, hey Sarah. Sarah asked, is that 70% native biomass that you were just talking about, is that that's required for supporting bird populations? Is it specifically woody, or does it also apply to herbaceous plants?
Yeah, so in that study, we only looked at woody plants. And the reason for that decision was that from a bird's perspective, they're mostly foraging in trees and shrubs. And trees and shrubs are making up the majority of the plant biomass that's out there. And so we can think of examples of birds that forage on herbaceous plants. Like classic example is like a goldfinch eating on sunflower, or I see my chickadees come to my goldenrods. But in general, most of their foraging is in trees and shrubs. And so it's not that herbaceous plants don't do anything. They definitely serve a lot of ecological function, especially from the insect's perspective. But at least from that study, because we were addressing the study from the birds, from the perspective of the territorial bird, we only considered woody plants for that study.
Awesome. That actually connected to a question that I had, which was how big the territory was for a chickadee.
Yeah, so on average, the chickadee's territory is about especially when they're feeding nestlings, they travel about 50 meters or so from the nest. So
Okay.
it's actually a pretty small area. I think that works out to be like less than 0.1 hectare or something like that.
Yeah.
It ended up being about the central yard and then the immediate yards around that yard. But once the young have left the nest, and for birds that are on migration or not breeding, they can use a much larger area. So in many ways, that actually is better for the birds, because then they can really hone in on where those productive trees are in the landscape and forage to their heart's content. But when they have a nest, they're really constrained to that central place. So that's where the biggest negative effects would potentially happen on that territorial bird.
Excellent. Thank you for clarifying that. Susanna asks, if oak trees are so important for so many caterpillar and plant species, what happens to the ecological balance when there is a wide die-off of oaks? And she specifically cites that something like this has happened in her area because of drought and possibly also Lamantria, the moth.
Yeah. So that's a really good question. So especially in New England, there is, for the folks like at Harvard Forest that have done these wonderful historical studies of what did the tree communities used to look like in historical New England. They used to be dominated by oaks, to a lesser extent chestnut, but mostly oaks, and especially white oak. And over time, all of these anthropogenic threats, such as spongy moth and oak wilt, and also harvesting, has led to, I think I read somewhere, well, don't quote me on this number, but it's like 20% less oak dominance than there used to be, or something. We have, the bottom line is we have much less oak biomass out there than we used to historically. And presumably that has a rather large impact on the ability to support arthropods, especially at a local scale. So that's not to say that other trees don't do anything. Of course they do, but at a local scale, having that abundance of oak, it doesn't just benefit the insects that use the oak tree, it actually results in spillover onto the rest of the plants in that forest. So for example, in this study of migratory birds we had in Springfield, Massachusetts, we were comparing oak dominated and oak dominated and non-oak dominated forests in and outside of the city. And so what we find in the forests that have more oak trees are more caterpillars, but also more spiders, more insect biomass overall, more predatory ground arthropods, more bird species in better conditions. So we actually see a lot of carryover effects in the rest of the food web just because of the dominance of this one keystone plant species. And that's why we call it a keystone, because it actually has this wide-ranging effect on the rest of the food web. So that's not to say that oak forests are the only thing that's important out there, because that's definitely not true. And in novel ecosystems, there are a lot of, we're making a lot of selection about different plants that can be in our cultivated and managed ecosystems. But it does give some support that we should be really paying attention to the health of our oaks in the landscape, and that if we have these compounding effects of invasive species and disease and pathogens, that can really make the negative effects of habitat loss exacerbated, because we also have these forests that are low quality or supporting fewer species interactions.
Thank you. Someone's asked that they said they've read that many sunflower cultivars do not make pollen, and they are asking about how we know to choose native varieties of these plants, or I think pollen-bearing varieties of these plants would be the question.
Oh yeah, so that might be a question for Lynn Adler
yes.
at UMass Amherst. I don't know a lot about sunflowers, but I do know that, there's the cultivated sunflowers, but then there's also a lot of native sunflowers that you might not necessarily think are a sunflower, but are in that same group. So it could be that there are other native plants that are within that genus that haven't been specifically bred to be pollen-less. For the sunflowers that do support pollen, I mean, not only are they, supporting lots of caterpillars and bees really like them, but there's also evidence that bees are going to them for medicinal purposes too. So why would anybody create a pollenless sunflower? I don't even know. Jeez, just avoid that like the plague. And when you go to the nursery and you ask those questions, that might make the person who's doing the ordering be like, wait, am I ordering pollenless sunflowers? Why am I doing that? They might not even realize. So, speak up.
For sure. And just quickly, I think if you see the term open pollinated, usually those have pollen on them. It's my experience. Mm-hmm. Someone has asked, if you can comment on honeybees and if they hinder the population of native bees.
Yes. So this is an area of research that I haven't spent a lot of time in, but it's definitely coming up a lot and something that I've been thinking about more. There is some evidence that when honeybees are around, as well as other introduced and especially cultivated introduced spillover onto native bees. There also is some evidence that honeybees can potentially outcompete other native bees for floral resources. So when you put a high dense colony, they go out, and if pollen is already limited, especially if we think about an urban ecosystem or a suburban ecosystem, an ecosystem that's already pollen limited doesn't need any more competitors out there. So at least on an individual level, there's some evidence. Rosemary might know more about how much evidence there is at a landscape or a larger regional level, but that is definitely something that we're hoping to look into with the State of the Bees information that we have. But I mean, at least in a broad sense, there's no reason to think that supporting honeybees specifically is a benefit to bee conservation. It's essentially it's a domesticated species. It's like saying I'm conserving songbirds by purchasing a chicken. But if you're planting flowers and trying to create more floral resources because you have a honeybee, well, maybe that's another thing. Maybe there's a place where we can work together, but that's an area of research that I think honeybee researchers could really shed a lot more light on for you.
Yeah. Thank you. It's a tricky topic.
It's tricky. Yeah.
Very tricky. Someone has asked, in urban context, what would you say to, I actually have this question too. What would you say to people reluctant to leave their leaves because it might provide habitat for rats?
Oh,
comes up in my city all the time.
yeah, that's a tricky one. I mean, we don't want rats around. I get that. So like, I'm always of the mindset to think about where can we come up with compromises. Like maybe we don't leave leaves across your whole lawn, or maybe we don't leave leaves next to your trash cans. Maybe we think about places in other parts of your yard where it might be more appropriate. Or maybe you consider the soft landing approach instead of the leaf litter approach. Maybe the duff and the dead stems and such from an herbaceous plant community might be enough. That's a question that I feel like each specific person in their yard might have a context that they need special information for. But I know I haven't heard rats before, but I have heard people phrase the same question in terms of ticks. And in many cases, the risk of ticks is perceived to be a lot higher than it actually is in people's yards. So walking into the woods where there's like tons of leaf litter and lots of mice and lots of microhabitats for those ticks to survive in, yeah, there's going to be a lot of ticks there. But in a lawn area, less so. In fact, some studies have tried to measure tick abundance for instance, when you let grass grow, and found that it didn't really make a difference at all. So it could be that there are and rats, and you might want to reconsider how you do it. But the more overwintering habitat that you can keep, the better, I would say, while making sure that you're safe as well.
Right.
Or maybe spend your time promoting area. Maybe you're like, well, I have this green space in my neighborhood, and I want to work towards preserving that. That's another place that you can spend a lot of energy too. And your yard can be part of the connectivity of those green spaces, but may not necessarily be the overwintering habitat.
Right. That makes a lot of sense, especially in an urban matrix or little parcels of land. Do you have, this is good. Do you have any suggestions for helping to educate neighbors about aggressive invasive plants that are displacing or strangling native trees and plants? The wooded areas in my neighborhood are increasingly dominated by English ivy, porcelain berry, oriental bittersweet, Japanese knotweed, etc.
This is the grand challenge. There's a lot of money that's being put into the control of invasive plants in natural areas, and almost no efforts are made to get people to remove the invasive plants that are propagating their seed all throughout in the adjacent neighborhood. And we know that those adjacent residential areas are the primary source of all of these invasive plants. I don't have the golden ticket answer for you for how to do this, but I will say that some of the things that have worked for me is to, number one, don't discount the cultural connections that people have for certain plants. So for instance, if somebody really likes English ivy, you're not going to be able to convince them that English ivy is a terrible, terrible, terrible thing, because they really like it. They think it's pretty, or they have, maybe their grandmother planted it. You're not going to be able to change that. What you can do is provide alternatives, and say, like, this one is native. It serves a lot of ecological function. It's like basically the same thing. There's a lot of substitutes that can be found out there, and helping people to find those and make those connections can be really powerful. Another thing is think about what sort of wildlife connections that somebody might have. So, in my case, I work with butterflies, and I work with bees, and I work with birds. Some people really connect to the bird story, and they might be like, oh man, I love my Japanese cherry. That's the best plant ever. But then when they hear the chickadee story, they're like, oh wait, that makes me think a little bit differently about my yard, because I really like chickadees. I have them on my Christmas card. Whereas other people may better connect with the bees or the butterflies, and sometimes just taking the time to show them and explaining the ecological situation to them can really make a difference. So I would say come from a place of compassion and understanding, and try to be supportive to help people make those connections on their own. And eventually you might be able to be the catalyst for larger change.
Excellent. Thank you. Kathleen has asked, is it more beneficial to wildlife to have a high diversity of plants or fewer species that are keystone plants? So trade-off question.
Oh boy. Well, welcome to the rest of my research program. I mean, so the best way to answer that question would be to actually do restoration plots and to study these things. Unfortunately, I'm not there yet. I don't have the money to do that, even though I really would like to. If anybody has a couple $100,000, I'll take it. But what we did, at least from a caterpillar perspective, is to simulate what would happen. And so if we use a computer simulation and we said, oh, what if we picked a high diversity of plants randomly, or we picked the keystone plants and then a couple of other ones randomly? And what we found is when keystone plants were intentionally included, you always supported more caterpillar diversity. So what does that mean for the rest of the food web? Well, these are really big questions that I'm going to spend the lifetime of my work focusing on. But I'll never say that we don't want to support plant diversity. We always want high diversity, because the higher plant diversity, the more resilience there is, the more species can be supported. But the more that we can do both, we can have high plant diversity and also intentionally including keystone species, the better.
Great. Sort of a related question. Does it matter what type of oak you plant?
Yeah, so that's another big question. Our analysis was based solely at the general level. So we were just saying oaks are oaks are oaks. And the reason for that is because in the historical host plant literature, that's where the data is most reliable. And there's also some biases depending on what species were studied in what region. There hasn't been a lot of really good species-specific data at the continental scale that we were interested in. Entomologists will tell you, especially in the East, the folks that I know, that if you really want to get a lot of insects, go to the white oak tree, not the red oak tree. So we definitely know that there are between species differences in communities of the insects that use them, but then also like there's differences in timing, in tannins, the chemicals in the leaves, in nitrogen. Like there's all these other kind of fine scale foliar nutrition differences that could the arthropods. Sorry, this is my cop-out. I have a grant that I wrote that's exactly on this question. And unfortunately, it wasn't funded the last round, but they gave us good, good scores. So we're submitting it this spring, and hopefully I'll have a better answer for you because I love that question. I totally have that question myself. But for right now, I don't have an answer for you. So just, get a native oak tree.
Yeah, and stay tuned.
And stay tuned, yeah.
There are two shrub questions which are very similar. The first was, what shrub would be at the top of the list like the oak? And then the other question is, do shrubs such as pussy willows and chokeberries have the same value as willow and cherry trees? Similar questions.
Yeah, so some of the plant genera that we had up there come in both tree shapes, sizes, and shrub shapes and sizes. So there's not like a real definition of like what is a tree, what is a small tree, what is a shrub, right? So for instance, there are oaks that grow into big mature oak trees. There are oaks that are shrubs. There are cherries that are big, huge, mature canopy trees, and there's cherries that are shrubs. I will say that in terms of what shrubs that I really like and that also tend to support a lot of bird and pollinator biodiversity, one of my favorites is viburnums. You can't go wrong with a viburnum because it's got flowers for bees, it's got foliage for caterpillars, the birds love it, and it's got fruit. It's beautiful. They work well. There's some for like every ecosystem. I just love viburnums. I think they're really great. There are, blueberries. You can't go wrong with a blueberry. They're great. A high bush blueberry can get pretty big. And then there are some dogwoods are not super high, but they're also a plant that a lot of people like, and they're not terrible. They were also up on the higher end, and they can have a lot of shrubs that have, again, beautiful flowers, lots of fruit. So they're hitting all of those things that we like. There's also, this goes down another rabbit hole that I'm happy to talk about, but there's also people working on cultivars too that are plants that are grown to be different structures or leaf shapes or colors and things like that. And we've had some research finding that if you select for a dwarf variety, so for example, a dwarf willow or a dwarf swamp white oak, that it doesn't make a lot of difference from the arthropod's perspective because you're not actually changing the leaf chemistry. So it could be that those might have a lot of potential, especially in managed landscapes where our area to work in is very limited, but we want to, plant some species. So
that's really, I didn't know that. That's really interesting. I live in Salem, Massachusetts, where the lots are small. So having dwarf varieties of things would be very, very useful.
Like it's not the same as the local genetic, the local genotype. So it's not, you know, if we think about a gradient of relatedness to the natural ecosystem, a cultivar is different. And I will totally admit that. But it might help more people to sign on because they'll be able to, if we reach more of those traits that people, and we know that people select things when they're easy, when they look great, you know. So the more that we can do those things, we might be able to get more people to sign on and also support ecological function.
Excellent. We have just a couple last questions. This one is very relevant for the season. How do you feel about feeding birds during the winter from feeders?
Okay, so first of all, I feed the birds. The reason that I feed the birds is because I really like the birds. I like seeing them up close. My son really likes to see them up close. And so, you know, really from the bird's perspective, they don't need seed. Like if you took it away, they will find other food resources. They're not relying on your seed. So the important thing is to recognize that what the bird feeding is really doing is for you. It's making you happy. And that's a wonderful thing. That's connecting you to nature. That's that is a wonderful thing to do. So if you're keeping a feeder that is clean, keeping your cats inside so they're not hunting your feeder, making sure that you're also creating places for the birds to hide and to find other high protein insect food. Then I don't see a problem with feeding the birds. So yeah, that would be my answer there. I mean, there was some recent issues that came out with birds that were potentially getting sick, and a lot of states asked people to take in their feeders. And I saw a lot of people jump on that and say, yes, I will. I'm going to clean my feeders. I'm going to take them down. And I just love that. So I feel like as long as we're doing it responsibly, then do it. Feed your birds and enjoy your day. You're with your coffee.
Well, there's one potentially quick one. Do you know anything about the viburnum beetle?
I know that they're everywhere. Yeah.
This is about controlling them and whether that's possible.
Oh gosh, invasive species are such a pain. Yeah. So yeah, you know, that's the thing, is the reason that these invasive insects get really abundant. They're imported, their host plant is here, and they're potentially predator free. So if in the case of the viburnum beetle, they're a plant-eating beetle, but relative to things like caterpillars and spiders, nutritionally, they're pretty low on the totem pole. So birds are not necessarily feeding on them. They might not have the parasitoid wasp that should be targeting them. So unfortunately, you know, I don't know necessarily how to control them, except to say that, yeah, I would talk with your local master gardener and see if they have any suggestions. If you do, I don't like to promote pesticides. I'm not trying to promote pesticides at all, but there might be situations where it gets so out of control that you might want to use some spot kind of pest management to try to get them to a level where the predators can then take over. And for some people, that might be as easy as spraying like something more organic, like neem oil or something that can help keep them under control, or even just spraying them off the trees. That might help. But there was a study in Washington, D.C. that found that the more structural vegetation that there is, the more predators there are, more arthropod predators, and the more they keep those sort of invasive insects down. So it may be worthwhile to plant more, maybe not viburnum, but some other things to keep that structural vegetation to promote predators to come in and help keep them under control for you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I do see we're at 8:28. I want to respect everyone's time. So first, I just want to say thank you, Desiree, again, for taking the time to be with us this evening and for giving us such a great talk and such important information. It was fantastic. And I also want to thank, again, Cary Library and the Cary Library Foundation, and of course, Lexington Living Landscapes for making this event possible. And finally, I want to thank all of you for spending your evening with us. I'm so glad that you did. And now I will turn things over to Matt.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you both, Rosemary and Desiree. This program was recorded and will be on the library's YouTube channel in the next day or so. And I just want to also extend my thanks to everyone for coming. And again, thank you, Rosemary and Desiree, for this awesome talk.
Thank you for hosting us.
Thanks.